The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Loud announcements echoing across the terminals, families hugging their loved ones goodbye, and travelers rushing to catch their flights. Among the hundreds of faces moving in different directions, there was one young girl no different from the rest. She wasn't wearing a uniform, didn't carry any special identity, and had no fame attached to her name. She was just a passenger, another ordinary traveler blending into the crowd. Her name was Emily. At only 21, she was full of dreams, but also burdened with doubts. This trip was not a vacation, nor was it for fun. It was the beginning of something new. She was traveling alone, leaving her small hometown behind to attend an important program abroad. For Emily, this journey meant freedom, courage, and a chance to prove to herself that she could survive in a world much larger than the one she had always known. She clutched her boarding pass tightly, glancing up at the digital board that displayed her flight number. There was a nervous smile on her face. Flying wasn't new to her, but it always carried that mix of excitement and fear. The thought of being thousands of feet above the ground, completely at the mercy of the machine and the people controlling it. Yet, like everyone else, she trusted the system, the pilots, and the aircraft. After all, she was just a passenger. Her job was simple: sit, wait, and arrive. When she stepped into the plane, she immediately noticed the contrast between the noisy terminal and the calm interior of the aircraft. The soft lighting, the quiet conversations of passengers settling into their seats, and the polite smiles of the flight attendants made her feel at ease. She placed her bag under the seat, fastened her seatbelt, and stared out the small oval window. The world outside looked peaceful, the runway stretching into the horizon, planes lined up like giant birds ready to take flight. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, checking seatbelts, giving instructions, and offering reassurance to those who looked nervous. Emily watched them with quiet admiration. "They make it look so easy," she thought. Her heart beat faster as the engines roared to life. The vibrations beneath her feet signaled the start of the journey. As the plane began to roll down the runway, Emily took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She loved this part. The powerful rush of acceleration, the sudden push against the seat, and then the miracle of lifting off the ground. When she opened her eyes again, the earth was shrinking below, the city turning into tiny dots, and the clouds welcoming them into their endless kingdom. She thought of her family, waving at her earlier that morning. Her mother's eyes had been filled with both pride and worry. Her father had tried to hide his emotions, giving her a firm hug and saying only, "Be strong." Emily had smiled, pretending she was braver than she felt. Now, as the plane climbed higher, she whispered to herself, "I can do this. I'm ready for whatever comes." The hours passed quietly. Some passengers slept, some read books, while others listened to music. Emily spent most of her time staring out the window, mesmerized by the endless sky. She imagined what it must feel like to be a pilot, to hold the power of controlling such a massive machine, to fly through storms, and to carry hundreds of lives safely to their destinations. She admired them, but never once imagined she could be in their place. After all, she was just a passenger. But deep down, Emily had something rare, a spirit that refused to break under pressure. Her childhood had been full of challenges. She grew up in a small town where opportunities were scarce and dreams were often crushed by reality. Yet, she had always been different. When her friends gave up on their goals, she kept chasing hers. When others said, "It's impossible," she would whisper, "Maybe not for me." Life had tested her before, but nothing could have prepared her for the test waiting above the clouds. For now, though, everything seemed calm. The hum of the engines was almost soothing. The seatbelt sign was off, and flight attendants moved, around serving drinks and meals. Laughter and chatter filled the cabin, creating a false sense of security. To everyone on board, it was just another flight. To Emily, it was just another step in her journey. Yet destiny has a way of choosing the most unexpected people at the most unexpected times. And soon, Emily would discover that her identity as just a passenger was about to change forever. Daya didn't know it yet. But before this flight ended, her courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. And when the world looked at her again, she wouldn't just be a passenger. She would be the one everyone, even the pilots, turned to in their darkest hour. The plane had been flying smoothly for nearly 2 hours. The passengers were relaxed, some watching movies, some dozing off, and others enjoying their meals. The calm rhythm of the engines gave everyone a sense of comfort, as though nothing in the world could go wrong at 30,000 feet. Emily was still seated by the window, her eyes lost in the endless blue sky. She was thinking about the future, about what awaited her at her new destination. Her mind danced between hope and worry, but never once did she imagine that her greatest trial was already forming in the silence of the skies. Then it happened. First, it was just a sound, a strange metallic groan deep inside the aircraft. Emily frowned, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. A few passengers raised their heads, puzzled, but soon returned to their books and screens. The noise faded, replaced once again by the steady hum of the engines. But only minutes later, a violent jolt shook the plane. Emily's drink spilled across her tray, and gasps echoed through the cabin. A baby cried, and a woman clutched the armrest with trembling hands. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on with a sharp ding. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing some turbulence." The captain's voice was steady, but there was a tension behind it that couldn't be hidden. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. Turbulence wasn't new. She had felt it before. But something about this felt different. The shaking didn't ease. It grew worse. The plane dipped suddenly, and passengers screamed. Luggage rattled in the overhead bins, and the lights flickered as though the aircraft itself was struggling to breathe. Inside the cockpit, the situation was far more serious than the passengers could imagine. One of the engines had completely failed, and the other was losing power rapidly. Warning lights glowed red across the control panels, alarms blaring relentlessly. The pilots worked frantically, flipping switches, calling air traffic control, trying to restart the systems. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as the aircraft continued to lose altitude. Back in the cabin, fear spread like wildfire. Some passengers prayed aloud, others clutched their loved ones, and many sat frozen in shock. The flight attendants tried to maintain calm, moving quickly through the aisles, but their faces betrayed the truth. They too were terrified. Emily gripped the armrest tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. Her mind raced. What's happening? Is this normal? No, this is something worse. The plane lurched again, and she was thrown against her seatbelt. For the first time, she saw genuine panic on the faces of the flight attendants, and that terrified her more than the turbulence itself. The intercom came alive once again, but this time the captain's voice was no longer calm. It was urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated and remain calm. We are experiencing a critical technical issue. We are doing everything we can to stabilize the aircraft." Critical issue. The words sliced through the cabin like a knife. This wasn't just turbulence anymore. This was life or death. Emily's thoughts blurred as adrenaline surged through her veins. She could hear passengers crying, someone shouting prayers in desperation, and another arguing with a flight attendant about what was happening. The atmosphere was thick with fear, suffocating, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Then came the most terrifying moment yet. The engines went silent. The steady roar that had been the heartbeat of the journey vanished into an eerie stillness. The plane was gliding, falling, a massive bird with broken wings. The silence was broken only by the screams of terrified passengers. Emily pressed her forehead against the cold window, looking down. The earth below seemed to be rushing closer. She felt her chest tighten as reality hit her. They might not survive this. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged desperate glances. They tried everything. Emergency checklists, manual overrides, but the aircraft refused to obey. One of them whispered words he would never say aloud to the passengers. "We're losing her." For the first time in her life, Emily understood what true helplessness felt like. She was strapped into her seat, powerless, at the mercy of forces far beyond her control. Her mind flashed with images of her family, her mother's tearful eyes, her father's hug, her promises of being strong. She whispered under her breath, "I can't die here. Not like this." The cabin tilted again as the plane dropped sharply and people cried out in horror. A man clutched the hand of his wife, whispering that he loved her. A child screamed for her mother. Everywhere Emily looked, she saw fear, raw, unfiltered fear. And yet deep inside her, something stirred. A voice she had always carried but often ignored. A voice that whispered not of fear but of strength. "You've faced challenges before. You're stronger than this. Don't give up now." Emily closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She knew she was just a passenger. She wasn't trained to fly a plane. She wasn't supposed to do anything except wait for the pilots to save them. But as she looked around at the terrified faces of those around her, she felt a strange shift inside her heart. Maybe destiny didn't care that she wasn't a pilot. Maybe, in this very moment, it was her courage that mattered most. What Emily didn't know yet was that her moment of choice was approaching faster than she could imagine. The passengers were on the edge of despair. The pilots were running out of options. The plane was falling, and very soon she would no longer remain just a passenger. The cabin was chaos. Screams filled the air. Babies cried. Prayers overlapped with shouts, and the metallic body of the plane groaned like it was ready to give up. The once calm journey had turned into a nightmare at 30,000 feet. Emily sat frozen, her hands clenched around the armrests. Her heart hammered so loudly she could almost hear it above the noise. Fear had her in its grip, but another feeling was beginning to rise. A strange, steady current that told her she couldn't just sit here and wait for the end. She glanced toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door stood firmly closed, guarded by two flight attendants trying their best to calm people and keep order. But Emily could see it in their faces. Something was terribly wrong in there. Even the crew had lost their composure, and that alone told her how desperate the situation was. The silence of the engines haunted her. The plane was no longer flying. It was falling. Controlled, maybe, but falling nonetheless. She could feel it in the tilt of her seat, in the way her stomach dropped with every sudden dip. And though the pilots' voices on the intercom had tried to remain calm, she knew the truth. They were losing control. Emily thought of her family again, her mother's worried eyes, her father's words, "Be strong." She thought of her promises to herself, that she would face life boldly, that she would never run from fear. And suddenly, in the middle of this storm, a thought came to her. Maybe I don't have to sit here. Maybe I can do something. Her seatbelt clicked open. The sound seemed small against the chaos, but to Emily it was the loudest decision she had ever made. A passenger beside her grabbed her arm. "Where are you going? Stay down! It's safer here!" But Emily shook her head. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I can't just sit here. I have to try." She pushed past the rows of panicked passengers, her legs unsteady. As the aircraft shook again, the flight attendants at the front looked shocked as she approached. "You can't be here," one of them shouted. "Sit down, miss. It's dangerous." Emily met their eyes with a strength she didn't know she had. "Please," she said firmly. "I need to speak to the pilots. Just give me a chance." The attendants hesitated, torn between rules and the raw desperation of the moment. Finally, one of them, her face pale and exhausted, whispered, "Go." The cockpit door opened, and Emily stepped inside. The sight before her was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Warning lights flashed across every panel. The pilots' voices overlapped with the frantic beeping of alarms. One man gripped the controls with white knuckles, pulling hard to steady the plane, while the other tried emergency switches, his headset filled with urgent instructions from air traffic control. But the most terrifying detail was the look in their eyes, fear, sharp and unmasked. Emily swallowed hard. For a moment, she felt small, useless, out of place. "What am I doing here? I don't belong." But then the plane jolted violently again, and her doubt was drowned by instinct. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice louder than she expected. The captain glanced at her, too distracted to question how she had entered. "We've lost both engines. We're running on minimal power, and we're losing altitude fast. We don't have control." His words were like a knife, but instead of paralyzing her, they sharpened her focus. She stepped closer, bracing herself against the trembling floor. "Tell me what to do," she said. Both pilots froze for a split second, as if they hadn't heard correctly. The younger co-pilot shook his head. "You don't understand. We're trained for this, and we still can't fix it. Just get back to your seat." But Emily didn't move. Her eyes locked onto the captain's, steady, unflinching. "You said you're losing control. Then let me try. What do we have to lose?" The cockpit fell into a strange silence. Even the alarms seemed quieter. Finally, the captain exhaled, a long, heavy sigh. Perhaps it was despair, or perhaps it was recognition that sometimes hope comes from the most unexpected places. "Fine," he muttered. "Sit here." Emily slid into the co-pilot's seat, her hands trembling as they touched the unfamiliar controls. The panels were a sea of buttons and switches, each glowing, each demanding attention. But instead of overwhelming her, something strange happened. Her mind began to focus. She remembered the countless times she had stared out the window, imagining what it would feel like to fly. She remembered studying diagrams of planes in her books as a child, her fascination with how machines conquered the skies. She had no training, no license, but she had something else: clarity, courage, and a stubborn will to survive. The captain guided her quickly. "Keep it steady. Watch the horizon. Don't fight the plane. Work with it." Emily nodded, her fingers tightening on the controls. The plane shuddered as if resisting her touch, but she held firm. Slowly, carefully, the nose began to level. Behind her, in the cabin, the chaos started to fade. Passengers noticed the change. The sharp drops lessened, the violent jolts softened. Whispers replaced screams. Hope flickered. Inside the cockpit, the pilots watched in disbelief. Their years of training hadn't prepared them for this moment. Watching a 21-year-old passenger steady a dying aircraft with nothing but instinct and courage. The co-pilot muttered under his breath, almost in awe. "She's actually flying it." And Emily, sweat dripping down her forehead, her heart racing but her eyes locked on the horizon, whispered to herself, "I'm not just a passenger anymore." The cockpit was filled with the constant beeping of warning alarms and the steady hum of failing systems, but Emily didn't hear them anymore. Her focus narrowed to the horizon outside the window and the trembling controls beneath her hands. The aircraft still shuddered like a wounded beast, but it was no longer plummeting helplessly. It was holding, fighting, staying alive. Behind her, the captain and co-pilot stared in disbelief. They had trained for years, logged thousands of hours, studied every emergency procedure possible, and yet, in this desperate hour, it was the untrained hands of a 21-year-old passenger keeping the aircraft steady. The captain leaned closer, guiding her through each movement. "Easy on the yoke. Gentle. Don't pull too hard. Keep your eyes on the horizon." "I've got it," Emily whispered, though her hands trembled. Her heart was hammering, but there was a fierce steadiness in her voice. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't just sitting, waiting, surviving. She was flying. The co-pilot's voice cracked with urgency. "Altitude's still dropping. We're not out of danger." Emily swallowed hard. The plane was still losing height. Yes, but now it was controlled, not chaotic. She could feel the aircraft responding to her as though it trusted her determination more than it trusted failing machinery. Her mind flashed with images of her childhood, lying on the grass, staring at the sky, watching planes draw white trails across the blue. She had always wondered what it felt like to command one of those giant birds. Now, here she was, at the controls of a dying plane, carrying hundreds of lives, and the world was watching her courage unfold. Back in the cabin, passengers clung to their seats, but a change had spread among them. The violent drops had eased, and for the first time since the disaster began, there was a fragile thread of hope. Mothers soothed their children, whispers replaced screams, and frightened eyes turned toward the cockpit door with desperate faith. A man in the third row murmured, "It's different now. Someone's flying us." Another whispered back, "But who?" No one imagined the truth, that the hands guiding the plane were not of veteran pilots, but those of a young woman who had boarded as just another passenger. Inside the cockpit, sweat rolled down Emily's forehead, stinging her eyes. Her muscles ached from gripping the controls, but she refused to let go. Every second mattered. Every breath carried the weight of hundreds of souls. The captain spoke rapidly into his headset, coordinating with air traffic control. They were too far from the nearest airport for a normal landing. The only chance was to guide the crippled plane to a stretch of open land, flat enough, wide enough, to attempt a miracle landing. The co-pilot scanned the ground through the windshield. His eyes widened. "There, a field. If we can line up, we might have a chance." Emily tightened her grip. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with unshakable resolve. "Tell me what to do." The captain nodded. "All right, listen carefully. Keep her steady. Lower the nose just slightly. Don't fight the descent. Guide it." Every instruction was like a lifeline, and Emily clung to them with every ounce of focus she had. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the plane, steady, controlled. As the earth rose closer, the cabin filled with tension. Some passengers pressed their hands together in prayer, others clung to loved ones. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every second heavier than the last. The wheels of the aircraft were lowered with a shuddering groan. Emily felt the vibrations surge through the controls. Her arms burned with effort, but she held steady. The ground rushed toward them, faster, faster, until suddenly there was impact. The landing gear slammed against the earth. The plane bounced violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Gasps and screams filled the cabin. Emily gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to panic. She held the yoke firm, guiding the massive machine as it skidded across the open field. Dirt and grass exploded in waves outside the windows. The plane rocked side to side, the fuselage rattling with terrifying force. For a moment it seemed certain they would tip, that disaster was inevitable. But Emily pulled back gently, coaxing the wounded bird into balance. Seconds felt like hours. And then, silence. The aircraft groaned to a halt, dust rising around it like a fog. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The world seemed suspended in stillness. Then cries erupted, not of fear, but of relief. Passengers sobbed, laughed, clutched one another in disbelief. The impossible had happened. They were alive. Inside the cockpit, the captain slumped back in his chair, eyes wide with shock and admiration. He looked at Emily, his voice breaking. You just saved us." The co-pilot nodded, still trembling. "We couldn't, but you did." Emily's hands finally let go of the controls. They shook violently, her body flooded with exhaustion. She leaned back, her chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. She couldn't believe it either. She had walked onto this flight as nobody, just another passenger, and now even the pilots themselves had watched her fly. When the door to the cockpit opened, dozens of eyes turned toward her. Passengers stared in silence, realizing the truth. The young woman who had walked among them quietly hours ago had become their savior. A little girl pointed at her and whispered to her mother, "She's the one who flew us." Emily lowered, her gaze shy under the weight of their awe. She had no medals, no training, no recognition. But in that moment, she had something greater, the gratitude of every soul she had saved. As rescue teams arrived, and the world would soon hear the story of the passenger who became a pilot in the sky, Emily understood something she never had before. She wasn't just ordinary. She wasn't just a passenger. She was proof that courage can come from anywhere, that destiny can choose anyone, and that sometimes, in the darkest moment, heroes are born in the most unexpected ways. And high, above the broken silence of fear, Emily's name would be remembered forever, not as the girl who boarded quietly, but as the passenger who dared to fly.